Now, I have said before that occasionally I need to make more discussive videos where I look perhaps speculatively at some things within 40k. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to be switching to this kind of format with regularity, far from it, but sometimes things pop up where you just think, wait, what? Now, recently two things hit that pretty hard, and this was in part due to the changes coming out from 9th edition 40k, but also there is more new lore continually being added and updated, in fact more than ever, and quite frankly, I just can't keep up with most of it. There is just so many books flying out from Black Library that I would need to spend nearly all of my time reading just to stay on top of it. So I have to pick and choose what to talk about and focus on in those things, and also there is a lot of stuff which I still haven't even gotten to, let alone all the new things as well. Now sometimes this might mean I'm going to have to create additional addendum vids as I have done with the Emperor, but I actually kind of like that. It sort of reminds me of the nature of the 40k galaxy and how people might at one point think that they know the way things are, only to then be given additional information later that changes this up. So in that sense, I'm actually fine with it. Now, saying that, recently two things came along that literally had me feeling pretty solidly confused, and one far less than the other. The first thing today is actually not that complicated in honesty, but in both instances I'm actually interested to see people's own thoughts and rationalizations. One of these things has actually been a core reason why my third part of the Dark Origins video series has not come together yet. Now, unbelievably, that Dark Origins series was basically a year ago pretty much, and that's crazy, but I did have a good reason, like I say, as to why it's not been finished. Because when I first started putting together the Dark Origins video, looking at the nature of chaos, the origins of the gods, I hadn't any idea that the Psychic Awakening was about to be released. So I actually have had the part 3 written for a long period of time. I need to go back and revise it, but this series posed a lot of curious questions and potential new information in this Psychic Awakening, so I decided that I needed to delay that third video until I've had time to check out the Psychic Awakening series, because I was worried that I would make this big video and then suddenly something would come out and completely undermine it. Now, lo and behold, the final book in that series has indeed created quite the problem, and we will discuss that shortly. After this video today, I am very hopeful that one way or the other I can begin finishing that Dark Origins Part 3, because that just needs to happen now. Now, the first thing I want to discuss is a very recent change surrounding Firstborn Marines, and I have to talk a little bit about tabletop, but trust me, it connects to the lore as well. Now, if you didn't know the term, Firstborn are basically the traditional Space Marines who have been around basically forever. Now, the change itself was not necessarily in the lore, but in the tabletop. And as I recently noted, sometimes there are weird overlaps between the actual 40k tabletop game and the lore. Curious discrepancies which can potentially undermine one another, or they can just align smoothly. Now, throughout the 8th edition of 40k and the emergence of the Primaris Marines, it has been widely assumed that the Primaris were looking to replace fully the Firstborn Marines, the traditional Space Marines. There were lore rationalizations for this, but also many of course have observed that it seemed that Games Workshop wanted to move Marines on and have Primaris take the place of the default Space Marines. Many people noted that this is a great way to have old-timey Space Marine players like myself basically repurchase their entire army. It's a fairly cynical outlook, but also plausible. Now, I was not about to just go and do that. I've instead been moderately adding to my existing army of Marines with some Primaris, and I remained hopeful that perhaps Games Workshop would give a small points tweak to the classic Marines just to keep them viable a little longer. At the same time, over the past couple of years, I've made my peace with accepting that the writing was on the wall for Firstborn Marines and the Primaris were basically getting ready to put them in their graves, so to speak. However, suddenly, out of the blue, to the shock of all, Games Workshop recently announced a sweeping series of stat updates for units, and I've included the link related to this in the notes below the video. Essentially though, many weapons have had a tweak for the Imperium, but also for Xenos like the Necron Deathmarks, and the biggest and most unexpected change is that the Firstborn Marines are now going to be given 2 wounds. Now, for those of you who don't play the tabletop, what the hell is that? Wounds are basically what you would classify as maybe lives or an individual model's health. You know, when you get to 0, you're dead. Now, as the quote sitting below a Firstborn Marine in the article says, "An extra wound, I'm finally as ultra as I always knew I should be." Indeed, in fact this raised a very curious question, which was suddenly, wow, Firstborn Marines are basically on par with Primaris. Now Primaris still have some extra bits of kit that the Firstborn do not, tanks and other things, and the points for taking them also just reflect that, but still it is a huge move up for Firstborn Marines. It basically makes the traditional Marines viable again. Now for somebody like myself with a sizable army of Firstborn Marines, this was mind-blowing news. The changes went further as well, with Terminators also increasing their wounds up to 3, and the same will apply to Chaos Marines, much to the delight of Chaos players. Now, as interesting as this is for those who actually play 40k, for those who are just enjoying the lore, you might say, who cares about this, LT? Well, I hear you, but also not so fast. Ordinarily, I would agree with you, stat changes in the tabletop, what has that got anything to do about the lore? Well, potentially in this case, a good amount. You see, up until now it had been fairly clear in my head that Firstborn were steadily being replaced and or upgraded as Rubicon Marines. We know this from the whole transitional process of Calgar, but not all chapters were upgrading as fast as others. Some probably were resisting it to a degree, but the emphasis was certainly seeming to be that the Firstborn were on the way out. It also felt strongly implied that they couldn't hold their own comparative to their powerfully upgraded Primaris brothers. And this, though, wouldn't be the first time we've seen Marines being upgraded. From the earliest inception of superhuman warriors, the Emperor revised his creations, and so it seemed that Belisarius Cawl was simply doing this again. In fact, I had been ready to speculate plenty about the fact that maybe this was yet again another case where the Emperor's creations were just going to be obliterated and replaced. Cawl, after all, has blended into his mindscape elements of the scientific genius that enabled the creation of the original Astartes, so his ability to basically remake Space Marines and forge this new iteration made reasonable sense. So the writing was on the wall for the Firstborn, or so we thought, because then comes this stat upgrade like a bombshell. Suddenly everything is turned upside down. Another thing was that a great many people had been mumbling for some time about Chaos Primaris. In fact, many assumed that the return of Fabius Bile would be the trigger for this, and that soon after his return we would see his creations of Chaos Primaris, but so far that has not materialised. It's not to say that it couldn't in the future, but there hasn't been anything to that really yet. This seemingly sudden U-turn though by Games Workshop on Firstborn Marines brings them back into contention, because out of the blue they no longer appear to be redundant. They can hold their own, they can fight seemingly with as much strength, toughness and life energy as a Primaris, and their armour is just as good also. They don't have some of Cawl's new toys, but killing Xenos doesn't need fancy bells and whistles, it just needs the Emperor's holy bolters. It's difficult to know if this change was a long-planned intention by Games Workshop or if it was a sudden decision. I personally can't really make any sense of it. It seemed for the longest time that Games Workshop was all in on Primaris, and that certainly still seems to be the case. The new Indomitus box and the new starter set are all in for Primaris. Yet if that was the case, then why change up these stats for the Firstborn? Now, I suppose what you could argue is that they have now spent enough time establishing the Primaris as the front and centre units for the Imperium and the Astartes, and so now at this point most new players will be buying Primaris, so it's no skin off their nose to bring First Marines back in line and make them viable. And this certainly pleases old school players like myself and makes us feel like, hey, we don't need to bin all our trash Marines after all. On the lore side of things though, it's more confusing because it's like, okay, so they were replacing Firstborn Marines and had even begun to steadily augment and upgrade them so as to make Astartes more powerful, but now Firstborn are as powerful as Primaris? In many ways, this somewhat undermines the narrative that's been laid out as to why Primaris were necessary in the first place. If the Firstborns are as statistically powerful as Primaris, why did we need them again? And this is of course, as I said recently, why tabletop and lore very often do not line up well, because it creates odd situations like this. Now, my current rationalization for this is that the process of upgrading Firstborn Marines is actually far more difficult than perhaps they first realized. So far we have mainly seen characters like Marneus Calgar and Mephiston being upgraded to Primaris as per the description of Calgar's transition to a Primaris Marine. He barely survived. And this doesn't seem to be the case though for new candidates who are being turned into Primaris Marines. We know this because of the Indomitus Crusade Mechanicus Genitors were sent out to aid chapters in producing their own new Primaris. And this seems to be a more straightforward thing because it's taking a base human and then just augmenting them like you would with a Firstborn Marine. Whereas Firstborn themselves are already Space Marines, so you're going to have to kind of retroactively upgrade them. as was done with Calgar. So you're having to delve back into their well-established genetic augments and tweak them, something which is clearly going to be pretty complicated. Now also I speculate that perhaps Call is one of few in the Mechanicus who is really truly capable of doing such surgery to a good degree, and that it is in fact for everybody else a very slow, dangerous process to upgrade Firstborn. It's also worth noting that while some chapters accepted that they should gift all of their new aspirants with a complete set of the Primaris organs, essentially just switching to producing Primaris, other chapters only allowed a certain percentage of their new aspirants to gain this benefit, so they were leaving the others to still develop as traditional Firstborn Astartes. And this is another point to remember as to why Firstborn are not redundant but still very actively present. So in considering all of this, it highlights why Firstborn are still around and why they are still relevant. They're probably not being quite so actively created, but for the many chapters of Astartes that are out there, it seems that many are unwilling to switch just to full Primaris production just yet, in terms of adapting Firstborn Marines to Primaris through a complex process of dangerous surgery. It seems unlikely that they could just immediately gain access to that also, and this is another likely reason as to why Firstborn still remains so prominent, because you have chapters all across the galaxy and they're not going to suddenly just get access very quickly or be willing to switch over. These recent stat changes do make me pretty happy because I did not want to see the Firstborn disappear anytime soon. They may have still small limitations comparative to their Primaris counterparts, but it's far from the huge leap that occurred between the Thunder Warriors and Astartes legions. So it remains my slim hope that things will slow down a little bit from here and give the traditional Astartes a few more innings before they have to bow out, because I remember for years wishing 40k would start moving forward. But also at the same time, you know what they say, all things in moderation. So next we come to the more difficult of the two things that have been weighing on my mind. And this will take me a little more time to get to the point here, but please stick with me. Now, since reading the section of new lore related here, this has become one of those burning issues that has really ruined me of late. It keeps coming back to my mind. And the one small caveat for me is that, as I always say, if it's only mentioned once, then you can certainly question its validity. You guys all know my thoughts on canonicity in 40k, but on the slightly negative side of things, this one is quite a heavily established battle situation, not some small aside or Imperial officer's report, and therefore that makes it more difficult to dismiss as being a thing. Now, what am I talking about? Well, in a roundabout way, I'm talking about, again, faith. Now, in the Dark Origins series, as I mentioned in the beginning, we were considering about how the effects of human actions, their beliefs including faith and worship to a degree, contributed and continues to contribute for the development and further empowering of the Chaos Gods. I also discussed around this concept in the Emperor Part 3 addendum video because there was some need for clarification. Now, I'm not going to drill down too hard on that today because that's for Dark Origins Part 3, but what I do need to do is ask a question, and a question that has arisen because of a new piece of reference in the Psychic Awakening book, Pariah. I should bother to note, I am not a religious person at all, never have been, but I spent a good time reading around the concept previously about faith and came to my best conclusion on just what exactly having faith meant. In my previous description of the Emperor Addendum video, I found a good amount of people in the comments, to my surprise, explaining that as people who they themselves personally held religious belief, they were surprised that they felt my analysis was in fact absolutely spot on and an excellent description. I should also note that probably in equal amount, I also had people telling me that I had no idea what I was talking about. So basically YouTube continues being YouTube. Either way, I still feel that my personal understanding of what faith means sits just fine with me. In essence, what I explained was that faith is not an emotion as such. It's not something you feel, as it were. It's that having faith in a figure, be it a chaos god or the emperor, is not something that would then literally empower those beings. I explained it this way, that you can have feelings about your chosen deity to worship, passionate feelings, but I would argue worship isn't a feeling specifically, it's an action, an expression of your existing emotion towards something or going through the ritualized actions associated with your belief system. Now that's a little bit of semantics, but the point was that then off of that, I came to conclude that faith is the point at which you go from trying to choose between something or to perhaps rationalize it, to where you come to an understanding that in your own mind that this is your reality, your belief system, and you believe it to your core. Once you've found that faith, it should be unshakable by your emotions, because you have come to realize that as a certainty, that no matter how disastrous the event or any subsequent tempest of emotions can be caused by harrowing loss or suffering, whatever you may be feeling is akin to those powerful emotions breaking over your faith like a violent sea might break over solid rock. Now imagine faith being something like a lighthouse, and the maelstrom of a sea around it is your own questions, doubts, uncertainties, perhaps everybody else's questioning. No matter what is thrown against it, your faith remains unmoved, because your faith, be it in the Emperor or the Chaos Gods, is not a feeling or an emotion that waxes and wanes. It's not something you may only feel occasionally or just in an extreme circumstance. It's a constant certainty. It's distinct and separate. Faith is knowing to your core that the understanding you have concluded is unbreakable no matter what else is occurring. Now, of course, this is not to say that that's how it works in practical reality. And that's something I didn't clarify last time, because I think there's a difference between defining something on paper and how it actually functions in reality. We know people often talk about having a crisis of faith and so on, where something hits them so hard they may become shaken and question that certainty. But in concept anyway, that was my understanding. So middle, what's the point, LT? So my point, and heads up, I will say spoilers here, which I don't often do, but because this is relatively new material in the last book of the Psychic Awakening. So if you wanted to still read Pariah, it did come out a month ago or more, but if you still wanted to read that, spoilers. So in Pariah, we learn about how the Imperium traveled to discover the Necron Illuminor Xeras has been constructing a realm using blackstone pylons, something in this region of space being referred to as the Pariah Nexus. Now, this is recorded in the Nephilim sector, and just what the Imperials discovered here was that they had entered into what was effectively a null zone. Now the Necrons had basically created an anti-psychic field, much like a psychic null creates. However, just like psychonulls, like the Sisters of Silence, this zone affected not only psychers like navigators, but it also began to affect even ordinary non-psyker humans. And this again goes to show that humanity is in fact a partly psychic race, certainly enough to be affected by a null field quite badly. And the effects were quickly apparent. Guardsmen were hit by a powerful feeling of malaise and reported feeling very watched. They became paranoid and anxious. And then later they were hit by feelings of exhaustion and despair. Some began abandoning their posts, fighting between one another, and others were losing their minds completely. However, the critical thing here is that the Adepta Sororitas was seemingly somehow immune to this. And this is the huge problem for me. You see, however you want to define faith, worship, etc., as I talked to, I was always under the assumption that there was an element or a connection with the warp when it came to the Sisters of Battle and their sort of religious abilities and powers, because most everything is connected with the warp. People worship it, people have powerful feelings. Their faith enables them to keep this connection, and by it they power and fuel either the dark entities of chaos or the faith and worship from those in the Imperium should, depending on what you subscribe to, also help fuel the Emperor, along with of course the sacrifices of the many psychers to his throne. Let's be real, it's probably mostly that. So I basically always assumed that when we see these miracles occurring within the Imperium, not necessarily for the Sisters of Battle, but just holy events where the Emperor is supposedly reaching out and giving some grand action to save warriors of the Imperium, that it was heavily implied that some sort of psychic action from the warp, or at least via the warp, was occurring. Yet here in the Pariah, the Sororitas are not affected by these nullification fields that shut down dead all psychic activity. Now, here is a short excerpt to highlight this. Ephriel Stern's full power was unleashed, hair and cloak flying, eyes shining with white fire. The Demonofuge rose into the air at the battle's heart, with the wings of the Aquila spread around her, wrought in lightning and flame. Where that light burned, even those who had stilled rose again, their eyes clearing, while those who had flagged drove forward with blades flashing and battle cries on their lips. Shimvok watched nonplussed, for surely the cryptech's strange dampening field was supposed to prevent just such manifestations of psychic power. He could not know or comprehend that it was holy faith, not warp-spawned puissance, that enabled this miracle to manifest. The Imperial warriors understood well enough. However, their prayers and hymnals swelled defiantly as Stern's energies lashed blazing rents through the Necron lines, sending a second Dolmen Gate toppling in flames. With resurgent faith in the Imperial ranks and the Necron command structure in tatters, the result of the battle was never in question from that moment onward. By the time the last of the Dolmen Gates was smashed and the structures around them demolished by the point-blank fire of the Knights, one thing was clear: faith was a weapon that the Imperium could use to counter the Necron's awful entropic weapon. Battlegroup Kalides might yet prevail. So here they talk about faith being a weapon the Imperium could use? What is going on here? Now, I am certainly not too proud to admit that this just confused the hell out of me, because, okay, if it's not a psychic-related power, which it clearly isn't, just what on earth is going on here? I mean, if it's not that, then really your only logical conclusion is that it's some other miraculous power. And it's like, so wait, are we then assuming that the Emperor is some kind of actual god in the truest, most ancient living sense of our understanding of that meaning? Not something that we can ascribe to the powers and processes of the warp? Now, sometimes when I want extra input towards these things, I might reach out to some other people, but most were still equally confused, because this really just seems to contradict a lot of things, and quite honestly just not make much sense. So I spent a good solid weeks thinking it over and discussing, and we were having a hard time really coming to any meaningful conclusions. However, I spoke to one or two people who actually had some quite solid thoughts about this. So in the end, the best theory that I encountered while discussing this in relation to just what was going on with the Sororitas in the Pariah Nexus that also makes the most reasonable sense is as follows. Basically, the idea of the Emperor doing what we perceive to be psychic miracles, reaching out from the warp with sentience, is entirely wrong. And that although humans think of the Emperor as a watchful god overseeing their plight, is again something that exists purely in the imagination, the romantic imaginations of mortal humans. In actuality, the Emperor acts more like a power reserve that can be tapped into. So in the Pariah Nexus, the Necrons have cut off all connection with the warp using their Blackstone pylons. As I explained before, this means anybody who needs psychic void fuel becomes basically worthless. Even ordinary humans are suffering because of how bad it is. But the Sisters of the Sororitas do not. In fact, they're even able to assist others to not suffer. And this implicitly suggests that something else is going on. Now, I have not come to discuss it yet, but at some point we will talk about the Emperor's plans, and the abridged version is that he clearly had ideas about the future of humanity, not just where it would exist, but also the actual development of humanity itself in a much bigger sense. It's certainly skirted around often, and this idea that the Emperor understood humanity was moving toward becoming a psychic race, and that in order to survive, they would have to somehow cut themselves off from fueling the darkness in the warp. This could be another reason as to why he tried to hide the sort of reality of the warp from humanity. And remember that the Emperor explicitly did not want humanity to believe in him as a god. He was merely acting to guide humanity toward their own ultimate destiny. Now, of course, you can debate that depending on which position you want to take, but thinking about faith and even faith today, it sometimes is attributed to miracles or successes that appear to be far outside the realm of things that could have literally been accomplished by humans, be that surviving illness or some other greatly problematic situation. So what we can think about is humans' ability to actually perhaps achieve things that are outside of our own understanding. But perhaps what is happening here in the Pariah Nexus for the Sororitas is simply humans being more powerful and capable than we understand ourselves to be. This has actually even been shown in medical studies where, for example, people given a placebo in some instances have recovered from conditions or improved conditions better than those who'd actually undergone surgery for it. Now, we don't want to get bogged down in arguing about real specifics like that, but just what I wanted to get at is the overall point that humans just generally are often shown to be able to achieve things far beyond what you might think us generally capable of, especially when the odds are stacked against an individual. However, cynical hat on, you could also argue if 100 people were to be placed in a problematic situation and only a small percentage of those survived, others might attribute those few as having been blessed or achieved some miraculous thing, when in actuality, perhaps they were just kind of lucky for some random other reasoning. Yet we, because of our nature, attribute it to things beyond our understanding. This is very common in human nature. So still, in the case of the Sororitas, we consider that perhaps in the 41st millennium, humanity has evolved to other levels. I mean, we can know that to be literally the case given the emergence of psychers and other things like navigators and so on. So perhaps there is something else happening in the development of humans, an untapped power that is displaying itself under the guise of faith and powerful religious indoctrination within the Imperium. And that now what we see and perhaps begin to understand is that the Sororitas are actually tapping into a power that is entirely different to common psychic manifestations. Or it could also be that maybe this is some higher level of psychic achievement. Maybe this is something that goes beyond, and hence why the series is referred to as the Psychic Awakening. Maybe the reference to psychic is not meant to be taken quite so literally, and the awakening is referring to something else going on within humanity. That's another possibility. The best description, though, was made by saying that while the warp itself is fuel for psychers, we should remember that it is created from primarily the human subconscious, things like your doubts, fears, angers, aspirations, those things which dwell and burn in the back of your mind. So perhaps the next evolution of psychers will not actually require the warp so directly, that they can in fact sort of sever themselves from it, and perhaps also control much more powerfully their own emotions so as to not have any doubts or fear or anger. Because if you look at the Eldari, the Eldar, we know that this is what they do. And again, this is something people often miss with the Eldar. They actually control their emotions to better resist themselves, disconnect themselves from the warp, but still use it. And maybe humanity is kind of moving more in that direction. This actually goes again towards the Chaos origins. People always say, well, in the War in Heaven, the Eldar were being horribly slaughtered and so on and so on. The Eldar, although they used the warp very powerfully, were quite disconnected from it. Their souls worked differently. The Necron's souls were being consumed by the Catan. So even though, yes, the War in Heaven was massively destructive, it may not have actually surprisingly contributed to the warp as much as people might imagine. So within the Pariah, this was probably the only part of the Psychic Awakening that I really invested significant thought in, because it raised all sorts of questions. What is going on with the Sisters of Battle? We know that they have a very different outlook to most. They're absolute extremists in their view, and so it is perhaps this fanatical devotion of repression and mental focus that has enabled them to unwittingly tap into something that they couldn't have realized nor understood. But given the ignorance in terms of scientific or just mental exploration within the Imperium, in doing so, it has in fact only furthered their beliefs and further saturated their strength of mind, because of course they're going to attribute it to their sort of religious beliefs, their faith, their certainty, and that this is so powerful comparative to others, they are able to either overcome this Necron nullification field, or there is some other possibility that perhaps again these are the first tiny specks of light, that we're heading towards something like the rebirth of the Emperor. Perhaps the Emperor is reaching out, but only with his powers, to those most divine vessels. We know that some within the Inquisition believe he can only be reborn to the most purest of human vessels. But all of this, it's a puzzle wrapped in an enigma, and it's either some master plan that is being laid out, or it was just bad writing by somebody who didn't fully understand the consequences of what they were putting into play here. I would significantly hope it to be the former. However, with all of that said, and as I have noted, one event doesn't make a certainty, and I hope that as the Necrons continue to utilize their Blackstone pylons throughout the galaxy, this means that the Sisters are going to seemingly continue to remain unaffected by the null fields created, and this may help us to gain further understanding or illustrations or speculations by other characters as to just what is going on. We'll continue to see that the Sisters are somehow immune to these null fields that are created, but that at the same time they're using powers that by any other definition would be psychic powers. Flying, white hot energy coming out of the eyes, energy around their weapons, holy light. It is all the things that you would expect to see from psychers. Have the Sisters unwittingly tapped into some latent human ability to use psychic power despite nullification? Or is this in fact some strange other manifestation that we cannot begin yet to even understand? Is the Emperor a true god in the most ancient sense? I think quite honestly it is still all up in the air. But as of right now, I still have certainly come to no firm conclusions so far, but I do look forward to discussing and speculating it more in the future, it may be one of those things which is going to require addendum videos to clarify and update and just increase our knowledge of as things go along. But as for today, I'll say, guys, thank you very much indeed for watching. As always, enjoyed this, hit the like for me, it helps a ton. And thanks as always for your massive support, guys. Tell me what you think down below, and I'll be back with some new stuff very soon.